And this is only 60 years ago. And we don't entirely understand anymore what happened here. It was very hard to find out when the windmill was actually up. Alistair and I met an old guy lying on the hills in the sun, partly sunbathing in his Mac. And Alistair got chatting to him in the way that he does. And the guy remembered, he said he remembered there being 2 towers, which there weren't, but and we thought he was just mistaken. But now I think he must have been remembering the smaller wind measuring devices. But it is so interesting how quickly a history like that can be lost. And if you think of the fact that the wind farms that we see around us here are only going to be there for 20 years, how long will it be before they have brown signs alongside them? So that's Mr. Golding, and part of the book, which will happen in a small form. I'm going to do a book which is going to be done with Arch Catalyst. Some of you might have seen their, I thought, really wonderful Moon Goose project, which was over in the museum. And they're very interested in the relationship between science and technology. And the book is going to be a how to make your own windmill, but not how to make it technically. It's really just about the enthusiasm and the feeling. So it's really what prompts people to have a windmill in Orkney, what prompts the farmer to give permission. And I'm going to include Costa Head in that, partly as a crucial technological site, but more really as a playful work of archaeology. Now that's 2/3 of the way through, just so you know where we are. And then I'll pause here and see if anyone wants to ask. Oliver, can you get me some more water? It's making me thirsty.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
You better take some cups.
Would you have known that site in Orkney?
No. No.
Has anyone else ever been? Yeah.
Looks like we should have a trip. Maybe that's the next thing we should. I have a question about ERA.
Yeah.
Presumably they've got archives.
They were
Down
subsumed
in Leatherhead. Place in Leatherhead.
Yeah. I think
My mother used to work there.
Really? That's my way in. I've been waiting.
I must ask her if she ever handled any material to do with wind energy. She might have done.
Golding's book, he wrote a book in '55, just after this experiment, and it's so important that it was reprinted in the '70s.
Yeah.
So his studies were still so pertinent, and it's still in print today.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the recent wind surveys do mention it, but you can tell they've never been to the site. And I imagine they're getting the photo, thank you, from that archive. Must be in the
sure
archives.
I can't believe that they wouldn't archive material.
They made one other turbine at the same time with a very different design, which was done by a French scientist called, excuse my pronunciation, Andranu or Andradu. And they immediately, that was put up at St Albans, it was immediately shipped off to Algiers to test it in the desert. It was found not to be that effective. So those were the two kind of seminal moments.
And that was in the 50s as well.
1950.
Really interesting.
And I think that these development, they were a very small group of people, and I think they were very put upon by coal and nuclear. Coal, the dominant force, still the new Labour government, and nuclear being the kind of coming future energy. And I think there was almost quite an aggressive argument against this. This would, I'm sure, seem very eccentric. But Golding actually in his book foresees the time when oil will be limited, which was very rare in that moment, and coal. And he's also writing for us, for our moment. A really fascinating study. The largest device he can foresee ever being built is a kilowatt. and we're now up to 7 or whatever. So that's another interesting thing about when technologies are invented. You can just see that one day there might be a turbine big enough to do 1/7 of what we got now. And I may be wrong on this, but I think he estimates what a country might be able to manage through wind at about 25%. Scotland's already aiming far beyond that. So it's also very interesting just to remember what happens with avant-gardes and what they see as being possible.
The site specificity of it's interesting because I have a personal interest in what's happening in the East Durham coalfield, and there it's much more like one of those poems where the refrain keeps getting changed by a word. There's a kind of iteration going on because on the hills in East Durham at one time there will have been windmills, like the one you showed as well.
Yeah.
And then there's pithead machinery, and all the pithead machinery, which was often at the top of a hill, is now being replaced by windmills.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of
Scale. Too.
yeah, and this kind of turning.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time when the planning consents were going in for the first ones, the big objections were by those who had a stake in the old energies.
Memory.
And when you said, will there be brown signs? There won't be. The turbines will be painted different colours and put at the bottom of the hill, like the pithead machinery is now. Because all
They
the
don't do that every pit, do they?
well, there's a lot.
Is there in that?
Well, there. I'm thinking of a few particular sites, but it's
Yeah.
So the way that you mentioned earlier on about the idea of Neolithic sites and choosing that,
Yeah.
and your flower analogy is really interesting here, but in East Durham, I think the beauty, or the now regarded beauty of the pithead,
Yeah.
all that machinery is being changed to what some would regard as the beauty of the turbine.
I've done work in schools down there, and usually the school will have the mining banners in it. So the community, I mean, in a sense, I found quite desperately was holding on to that memory.
Yeah.
Wind energy hasn't achieved that yet. There's no sense of communitarian, but it could if it was differently economically and politically structured. And they would have, not a blade, but, there's no reason. The investment in Durham is not with ownership, it's with the people that work there.
But there is a site specificity to all of this, isn't there? Because in a sense, if you've replaced one technology with another technology and then replaced it with another technology, that's different to putting a new technology somewhere where it's not been before. That's different to an entirely... This iteration, this kind of changing one word in the refrain of a poem so it becomes something new. That's an entirely different thing to suddenly announcing a new line. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that
So-
way, you're right.
So I'm not sure there's ever. I'm kind of not sure there's ever a right answer to because it seems to me so site specific, and this is really you're doing this kind of really interesting work to show what's been there before in the very recent past, and that's quite profound. But your way in would have been, where would you way in have been without that?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is how quickly people forget. I showed you on Orkney the small, almost like toy structures, the cloth, Cretan windmills from the 50s. And they were everywhere. A place needs a well and it needs a mill. Otherwise, there's nothing.
Yeah.
You're not there. And despite the fact that they were all a common object, when the wind farm goes up, that memory's gone. It's as if they were never there. So they didn't seem to have a discussion. I remember that. Now this is bigger. It's almost like this is an imported. It's still the debate is this an imported technology? Is this an imposition?
Yeah.
And Orkney is much further, I'm going to use the word progressive, than here in that respect,
Yeah.
because it's owned there, and they meet the guy in the pub who's doing it. And,
Yeah.
you know, you will get sensitivity about the Ring of Brodgar, and is it in that view, but still, I'm going to jump here. One of the interesting things about Orkney is also that the little islands then lead the way. The first ever community wind turbine in Britain was on one of the smaller Orkneys. And I can't remember, it's the one on the way to South Ronaldsay. You can drive over it, but it's an island, just beyond Scapa Flow. And one guy had the money, he put it up, but he made it a community turbine. And then once you start having them on Papawestry and these other little islands, and they suddenly become energy independent, they're ahead of the mainland. And those really are community turbines. When there's 60 of you that live on an island, and that's it. And you can get all your power from one object that you own, and you can suddenly also become a power exporter. That's a fascinating moment. And it seems to me to have a consciousness shift that the coal fields don't have, because they really don't have a relationship to that new technology. But you're right, there were windmills there, and now there are again. And I think what's interesting is the way we forget. And I'm sure it'll happen with hydro as well. All that really seems to happen is some impetus comes to reinvest in a technology and refine it, and it comes back again. But the cultural consciousness is so location specific and depends on cultural memory. And cultural memory in a place like this is, you know, to me, I don't know how to put it, but it has a kind of survivor mentality of those, you know, the coal communities will remember the mine being there and remember the strike, in my experience. It's different in Orkney. In Orkney, what they think about is Shetland and oil. They go, we don't want to miss out this time.
Exactly.
You know, and I think also there is this balance of limit. You know, like, how much do we want? And that's a discussion.
Yeah.
So I can't answer, but it's just odd how when does the community have a consciousness that can make that process
And
happen?
there are plenty of windmill hills about.
In,
There are plenty of windmill hills about that we don't know
Yeah.
about until we look on the map.
when you're in the Hebrides, what you notice is the windmills are always by the village halls. And sometimes in Britain there's a sense that they could be by the schools. And that's a way to change a community relationship. And that, you know, but that isn't particularly prevalent here. It can happen, but if you wanted to work on a progressive basis, which we very clearly don't at this moment in our culture, it would be in doing that. But I do think that you know, as you have the plaque on the village hall saying built by Enercon or built by whoever, that's one way that people might begin to change their mind. But the fact is that the mine is being remembered because of a whole communal wound, and wind is not having that effect on people. I think the interesting thing about Orkney is the immediacy with which people are relating to energy. We've all got used to power being in plugs, and we just feel completely divorced from any responsibility or celebration, or even to go left field, any spiritual feeling about the origin of our energy. It's simply a right we have, and it comes down the plug. To some of us, it used to be a nationalised thing, and that meant something. Some people don't even really have that memory anymore. But
it's interesting because it's beyond the idea of a kind of site-specific experience, because with water, for example. I mean, I grew up with the idea that water came out of the tap, and I now live in a place where it's spring water, so I know it dries up every now and then, and that's altered mine. And that's even more than site-specific. That's kind of so domestic that it's kind of part of my immediate day-to-day experience. I think about it every time in the morning when I go to put water in the sink or something like that. You know, it's really important. And I never bridged that across. And listening to you talk about Orkney makes me think of, I can't remember the name of the book. Somebody wrote a book about collecting oral history in the 1920s in France, and they were collecting stories about the First World War. And they found in different regions in France, there was nobody had any stories about the First World War, even though they were talking to people who'd actually fought in it. They had stories about medieval, about resistance to the French crown in the Middle Ages and things like that, because they were the most important cultural histories for those people. And the fact that they thought of the First World War as someone else's battle in the north of France, which they just happened to have to participate in. But they didn't retain any stories about it. They had stories of, you know, and I think the troubles in Yugoslavia were very much like that, weren't they, where they were still fighting over problems that were to do with aggression in the 10th century, and things like that. You know?
I think you're aware of your energy if you're on the Isle of Egg, and there's a moment when it switches from diesel to wind, and the light flickers. And maybe that's what we're going to go back to, is a moment when actually nature and energy are in that direct relationship. This wind farm, when I saw it from Dunsinane, I kind of imagined it like the famous thing in Macbeth where he's told that he'll be king until the forest marches toward him. And like, well, that'll never happen, and then it does. And this kind of looked like the forest, the strangeness, glinting in the distance. It's about 20 miles away. So I wanted to go there. And I also separately knew about a garden in this landscape. I didn't know if it was near it or not, but it had always interested me, made by a poet. I'll come back to that. If you look on the OS map, these are marked on, it's called Drumderg Wind Farm. Immediately next door to it is marked an SSI, I think, as in a site of scientific special interest, which is the Moss. And they actually abut each other, and I find that very interesting that you have both the technology marked and the thing that the technology, as it were, shouldn't go into. So this site is very important for its peat. It's very deep peat hags, which produces certain special flora and fauna. So it's a classic Scottish contemporary wind installation, bringing up all the issues of sublime technology, sublime landscape. And I've been there twice, which is why some of the photos look wintry and some look summery. Wild land. The poet who lived there was also a biochemist, a specialist, and a mountain climber specialist, and a poet specialist, and a gardener specialist. He made the most innovative and I think important wild garden in Britain, which is private, unknown, lost, beginning to decline. And he wrote a couple of books about it. I never give away its location because I discovered that the family still own it by accident. I thought that it had long gone. So I call it Duttonia. And his book is about how you garden at the margins. So it's about the local, and it relates directly to how Golding was trying to understand wind on Orkney. How does the contours of that hill affect every gust? And how will that affect the windmill? And in the same way, how does, when the snow comes, the frost, the different trees, how do they affect the garden? It turned out that this garden was 1.5 miles from the wind farm. So that's giving you a clue how to find it. And I took one phrase with me to this place from his book. In gardens, wilderness must be framed. I thought that was an incredibly thoughtful and moving concept about what a garden does. A garden is only ever an island within a wider landscape. And I took this phrase, framed wilderness, as a kind of motif, really for the whole project actually. What I was interested in was how a landscape like this and the wind farm might be related. How might we relate a human cultural act of cultivation with the site of a wind farm, which is treated in a very different way, as we know. This is G.F. Dutton. I never met him, but I did correspond with him briefly. I'm just going to flick through a few photos in this garden. It's so rich, very much about local flora, what can grow there. It's a very, very wild place in the winter. He talks about the snow coming in late October and staying till April.